Don't you love it when you play a video game, like a really good one, and you're able to up your Dungeon Master game at the same time? I love games, and I'm definitely guilty of translating video game mechanics I love into D&D finales that are as extra as they are exciting. Today on Bronze Dragon Inn, we're talking about Baldur's Gate 3 and what it can teach us about how to spice up our D&D game. Giving players a shared buy-in can sometimes feel railroady, but is amazing for campaigns where you want the pacing to be a little zippy. Yes, players should have some say in their character creation, but I think some stricter guidelines are good in order to maintain some of the overall flavor of the campaign. For example, in Baldur's Gate, all of your characters have different backstories, but for the most part, they're aware they're all inflicted with the same illithid worm, essentially forcing them together on this journey. They may not get along or even agree. They might not even be adventurers, but they still have to work together towards this common goal. Even though I hear lamentations from players all the time about those pesky railroading DMs, when you only have a few hours a week to play, and that's if you're lucky enough to defeat the scheduling demons and actually get a regular group going, having a concise plot with a clear direction to go can be a great thing. And sure, the players can choose how they want to tackle a given obstacle. They can choose which approach to take and which mysteries they might even want to solve along the way, whether to save the Druid Enclave or let it collapse under its own shitty leadership. But there are also fixed points in the story that the players can't change. In traditional D&D, I think sometimes we as dungeon masters hesitate to draw that line in the sand, but ultimately I think the story suffers when we fail to do so. A lot of times, when the DM would prefer a player not go a specific route, they'll call for a roll that's just about impossible to make. I think it's much better to gently remind the players that they're bound to the same fate and time is of the essence. I think Baldur's Gate 3 thrives on something that's actually missing from a lot of D&D games: trust. Not just between the players, but between the players and the DM. The Dark Urge is an entire background where the player has forgotten their past and is discovering it while they're playing. This concept is really fucking cool. It rocks, but there is an occasional loss of agency and you're essentially co-writing a character together. And this requires a really good relationship between the DM and the player. I dabbled with something similar in a show called Shikar with a good friend of mine, Xander Jeanneray, where we had this mutual trust for me to essentially help write some of his character's forgotten backstory. Now, although navigating character development in that way can be tricky, it can also be really rewarding, and I personally think it's worth the effort. Which brings me to my next point. Baldur's Gate 3 is a masterclass in how to make not only NPCs, but also characters that challenge, frustrate, and even occasionally annoy the other players, but they're not always outright evil, and characters that are even largely likable, but have some outlooks that are, well, a little shitty. But more importantly, these NPCs' attitudes towards the players and towards each other can and should change. The characters in the game make the player question themselves and can even be confrontational at times. But if BG3 teaches us anything, it's that confrontation is not only normal, it's good. Confrontation often leads to growth, and even though your relationship with a character might shift in a positive or negative direction, those difficult conversations often lead to a much-needed catharsis, an occasional resolution. Maybe your character starts out with an innate hatred of drow. It's important to not make this your character's entire personality, especially if there's room for that view to be challenged, for them to meet drow, and maybe even develop feelings for them. The alignment charts of old D&D days are still useful in the sense that they can show us not only where our character started, but also maybe where they're drifting to now. I think alignment can and should be fluid. Speaking of fluids, just kidding, I don't actually have a segue. What I really want to talk about is multi-level fights. Baldur's Gate 3 confirms something I've felt for a long time, which is that multi-level fights bring in more utile spells that otherwise don't get much play in the meta. Now, although the camera mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3 on these multi-level fights can be a little frustrating, you're not going to deal with that in real life. So I highly recommend thinking of your boss fights vertically. Give players advantage when they have the high ground. I love that Baldur's Gate does this. And punish them when their opponents outmaneuver them. Let them use gravity to their advantage or to their detriment. All this aside, I think my biggest takeaway from Baldur's Gate 3 is that the opponents don't actually give you that much EXP. Like, yeah, leveling is fun, but it's so much more rewarding and thematic when leveling up not only feels earned, but almost overdue. Because you have to remember, your characters aren't just getting a little stronger with a few more hit points. Sometimes they're learning whole new techniques and entirely new ways to manipulate the weave and channel their arcane prowess. That doesn't just happen overnight. Instead of experience, reward your players with other things. Magical armor, potions that are complete game changers, scrolls that give them one-time access to spells that are way out of their reach, broken fireball wands, necklaces that allow them to cast spells without using spell slots. Not only should you give these things to your players, but you should also give them liberally so that they don't feel like they have to hoard them. Give a lot, give often, and your players will hopefully not save them and instead actually use them, trusting that there are more on the way. A level 3 character with misty step boots, shrapnel grenades, a psychic damage sword, they can take on bigger challenges than a level 4 character dressed in their undies with mundane items. Like, yes, the health pools are smaller, but honestly, that just makes combat have more stakes and it's more interesting. Brings me to my second to last point, which is that Baldur's Gate 3, speaking of health pools, teaches us that we can be transparent about a boss's health pool. Showing the health on enemy characters does not take away from the drama or the stakes of the fight. If anything, I would argue it adds to it. Having half the party down while the other half tries to race against the boss to see if they can chip out that last bit of health before a TPK, not only does it add another layer of strategy to the fight, it better informs the players on whether they're even equipped for this fight or if they should flee. Being able to see the hit point pool can not only add to the dread of facing down a big bad that has 8 million hit points, but it can also instill hope when they invariably start to see that number shift. Not to linger on Coffin Run too long, but I love a visible health pool, especially one that I can drink. And this brings me to one of my last points. Allow players to leave combat, okay? Remind them that running is always an option. Let them know that they can always come back, but maybe next time the guard will be doubled. Or maybe the blow they struck to the Goblin camp was so decisive that the Goblin King may have survived, but now he's hunting the party down with the few resources he has left. Fleeing should not feel like giving up. It's not goodbye. It's a until we meet again. It allows you to preview mechanics that the party might want to prepare for. Maybe your big bad has a really cool psychic aura that disorients anyone within 15 feet. Now the players can embark on a grand quest to figure out a way to mitigate that somehow. It just adds another layer to the drama. Reminding, encouraging, and allowing your players to flee from combat allows you to put very challenging boss fights in front of them. And you can do it early. You don't have to save them from when they're higher level because you're kind of giving them a warning. You get to build up the story of defeat and rivalry, and that just adds to the drama of D&D. Anyways, I'm going back to my Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough. I still haven't left Act 1, and Gale is not going to feed himself magic items, but do let me know what mechanics you're stealing from Baldur's Gate 3 for your home game. I'll see you next time on the Bronze Dragon Inn, if we're still in business. Thank you to all the wonderful patrons of the Bronze Dragon Inn, but here's a special thank you to A. Haney, A. Parnell, Anonymous, Ghost of the Gray, M. Murray, M. Overton, Nolan, and Sashanka Kun. Your support pays our bar wenches.